The standing position can be a scary place to be. E1 wrestlers stalk the mats, judo black belts lurk in the shadows, MMA fighters are ready to make fun of us. What can we possibly do? Going head to head with these monsters is a recipe for disaster. An easy way to get injured and end up on the wrong side of a social media highlight reel. What other options do we have? Pull guard? That can't be it. There has to be another way. If only there was some kind of way to get competent in the standing position really quickly. Well, as it happens, there is. In his 3-part instructional series, Standing to Ground, John Danaher lays out his standing position strategy which he coaches to his students. From takedowns and fundamental skills, to scrimmage wrestling and upper body takedowns. John spends around 32 hours covering this exact topic. Although to spend all of that time watching the videos, taking notes, studying matches, and practicing the moves for yourself, you'd have to be some kind of lunatic. An idiot with a plan can beat a genius without a plan. So, what's our plan going to be? Any strategy that we devise is going to revolve around 2 key questions. 2 key questions that, if we're serious about standing with our opponents, we better have answers for. Part 1 of this video is going to focus around the first question, namely, how are we going to win? Once we've decided how we're going to win and have developed the best strategy, we'll look to part 2 of our study, how to stop the opponent from winning when they employ the same strategy against us. Thankfully, we don't have to start from zero. We have dozens of matches and years of data at hand, so we can already see what strategies and skills the top athletes of the sport are employing. From the outside looking in, watching stand-up in Jiu-Jitsu matches can often look like bad wrestling. Even John Danaher has some sympathy with this argument. Wrestling has far more sophisticated hand fighting and has had many more years than Jiu-Jitsu to evolve into the sport it is today. However, the typical suggestion that in order to get better at stand-up Jiu-Jitsu, players should go and practice some high school wrestling is a reductionist argument. The same way 100-meter sprinters and marathon runners would train differently, despite sports being considered running, Jiu-Jitsu athletes and wrestlers will train differently depending on the win criteria of the event they are competing in. Wrestling skills are transferable across various disciplines. For example, freestyle wrestling, submission grappling, and MMA will all contain elements of wrestling skills. However, technique selection and application will be different for each. For instance, in freestyle wrestling, athletes will wear shoes, allowing more grip and drive on the mat. This will also make it more difficult to slip feet out of holds. In MMA, athletes will wear gloves to protect their hands while striking, however finishing chokes or grips will be made difficult. The length of the match is considerably different for each event too. Wrestling rule sets typically last for 2 rounds of 3 minutes, with a short break in between. Jiu-Jitsu matches can range from one period of 5 minutes all the way up to no time limit matches. In the recent Craig Jones Invitational, we even saw Jiu-Jitsu attempt to emulate 5-minute MMA style rounds. The arena is different. Wrestlers will often compete within a circular mat space, with penalties for stalling. Jiu-Jitsu has experimented with a variety of spaces over the years, ranging from an elevated stage, falling from mats onto concrete, an MMA cage, or perhaps more recently, a walled style pit. The win criteria for each sport is different. Wrestlers can win by pinning opponents, whereas in Jiu-Jitsu rule sets, a pin means nothing or very little. It's only the submission that counts, and any points awarded will be starkly different to the points awarded in wrestling. In fact, the reason why Jiu-Jitsu at the highest levels looks like bad wrestling is testament to how much respect is paid to being submitted. One bad takedown attempt can lead to a quick finish. Hopefully now we can see that in order to be successful, we need to focus less on wrestling skill and more on performing well under a Jiu-Jitsu rule set. John Danaher has even dubbed this the 25% rule. In order to be effective in the standing position, we only need around 25% of the standing skill level of our opponent. We don't need to beat our opponent in the standing position, we only need to slow them down. By starting at our win conditions, we can work backwards and ask ourselves, how are we going to get there? The first win condition is to submit our opponent. While standing submissions are very rare, the setup for a submission often occurs way before a submission takes place. By making an opponent tired and weakening their defences, our submissions are going to be much more effective and have a higher percentage of success. The basic idea is that under fatigue, we get to see how good a person's technique really is. There's a reason why Gordon Ryan opts for longer matches. Even the Gracies were big fans of no time limit matches. The athlete at minute 1 of a match is starkly different to the athlete at minute 10. Therefore, fatigue over time should be incorporated into our strategy. John Danaher refers to this idea as asymmetric work rates, aka make the other guy work harder than you. Because Jiu-Jitsu matches vary in length, some being 5 minutes at the local level, all the way up to no time limit matches for some professionals, we'll have to consider tweaking our strategy, or at least have a backup for shorter matches if making the opponent tired isn't an option. The second win condition is to outscore our opponent on points. Different rule sets will have different criteria for points, however almost universally, the two best scoring positions are for the mount and rear mount. In fact, scoring points via takedown is not only quite difficult, but it also isn't highly rewarded. It doesn't make sense to utilise a large portion of our training resources, strategy and energy on something that has such a poor return on investment. Instead, we should build a strategy around causing defensive reactions that allow us to access our preferred scoring positions as often and as reliably as possible. Just as there are established positions on the ground, like mount, side control and close guard, the same concept of positions can be applied to the standing position. Each position will have a different goal or idea on how to escape or progress. To help navigate the chaos that is the standing position, I've listed some of the situations as follows. The free movement phase. This is where neither athlete has contact with the other. For the context of shooting takedowns, this would be considered long range. The clinch. This is where the athletes have contact with each other and tie up in various ways. However, neither athlete has a truly dominant position. For the context of takedowns, this may be considered medium range. The underhook. This is where one athlete has an underhook, but the hands are not locked. The opponent may have a whizzer, or they may be fighting for one. In the context of takedowns, this would fall into close range. After this, we're now in takedown territory, but still some work to go. The single leg. This is where one athlete has a hold of the opponent's leg. The leg can be in a variety of positions, either on the outside acting defensively, or passed across the hip. We'll talk about some of these positions later. Next we have locked hands. This can either be in the form of a body lock, or a locked hands double leg takedown. Either way, it's an extremely dominant position. Rear body lock. This employs the same locked hands as the previous example, however this time, one athlete is behind the other. Not all positions are created equal. In fact, out of all the positions we want to get to, the two that John prioritises above all others are the rear body lock and the short offense position. If we're standing and we can get to either of these two positions, we're going to progress and look to put our opponent into one of 3 priority scoring positions. These are turtle, referee's position, and the 4-point position. From these positions, our goal will be to threaten points from completing the takedown, points from taking our opponent's back, along with the threat of submission. As far as plans go, it's a pretty good one. The next question to answer is, how are we going to put this plan into action? A good snapdown will take you around the world. John Danaher has referred to the snapdown as the jab of grappling. Just as a boxer doesn't aim to knock an opponent out with every punch, he will utilise the jab for many tactical purposes, finding range and setting up more devastating combinations that can end the fight. The same is true of the snapdown. The snapdown will be our priority attack in the standing position. Instead of holding on to collar ties, we will be constantly seeking to off-balance our opponents and really move their head and weight around. This will cause lots of useful reactions that we can take advantage of. Ideally, we want to put our opponent's hands on the floor. However, the goal of our snapdown attempts are to tire our opponent, break their stance and posture over time as part of our fatigue-inducing strategy. By constantly ragging on an opponent's head, they will have to exert some energy to defend themselves. A tired opponent will be easier to take advantage of. The snapdowns will form the basis of a trilemma. The first horn of the trilemma is what happens if the opponent is either naive or too fatigued to defend properly. In this situation, we've been able to successfully put our opponent's hands to the floor. From here, it is possible to enter our front headlock series or jump straight into short offense. At the very least, as the opponent tries to stand back up, we will have opportunities to attack an opponent who is out of their ideal defensive stance. The second horn of the trilemma is what happens if the opponent overreacts to our snapdown. By aggressively posturing away, they leave their legs vulnerable to leg tackles. This will enable us to go into our own takedown attempts, preferably upgrading our position through threatening attacks to get to the rear body lock. The final horn of the trilemma is that if the opponent defends correctly but gets annoyed by the constant pulling on their head, they recognise the fatigue-inducing strategy being used against them and decide to shoot a takedown before fatigue becomes a factor. By forcing opponents to take bad shots, this becomes much easier to defend and counter. We'll talk about specific takedown counters later, but for now, just know that a good defensive sprawl will put us right into the short offense position. Unfortunately, we can't only attack snapdowns for the entire match. At some point we'll need to do a follow-up attack. Sometimes we'll come up against an opponent who knows how to deal with our initial snapdown spamming strategy. In this case, we better know what to do next. Takedowns from behind our opponent are a lot more efficient than trying to take down our opponent from the front. In the rear body lock position, there's very little offensive actions our opponent can be doing, which makes it very safe for us to attempt takedowns from there. Our priority strategy will be trying to get behind our opponent to the rear body lock. But a strong opponent isn't going to just let us get there. In fact, they probably know what our strategy is and will attempt to slow us down with their own hand fighting and collar tie techniques. So what do we do? The good news is that by observing the New Wave team, there are a variety of strategies we can employ. These range from arm drags, throw bys, slide bys, and duck unders. Each member of the squad has their own preferred setup and move, so there is a degree of preference within the system. The first tactical key is to be patient and stick to our fatigue-inducing strategy. In his match against Pedro Mourinho, Gordon spent over 6 minutes just being heavy on Pedro's head before making his first move and immediately foot sweeping to the rear body lock. In his no time limit match against Felipe Pena, he spent the first 8 minutes hand fighting and leaning on Felipe before sitting to guard. In the case of someone like Gary Tonin, who has excellent cardio and a good wrestling base, he doesn't need to exercise such patience. In fact, his strategy of employing fatigue over time is to attack relentlessly and force you to operate at a speed greater than you're normally comfortable with. If the snapdown we discussed earlier is the priority attack, then our priority reaction off the snapdown is to go for the arm drag. If we're able to get the opponent moving forwards off the snap, then the arm drag follow-up makes sense. Developing a solid arm drag and building secondary skills is an entire rabbit hole in its own right. The good news is that the arm drag combines really well with butterfly guard and wrestling up gripping strategies that we may already be used to. The first 3 variations of arm drag that John suggests focusing are the head inside arm drag, the head over arm drag, and the sliding arm drag. These 3 variations work best when the 2 athletes are bent over or leaning forwards. Fans of Gary Tonin will begin to recognise how frequently he spams the sliding arm drag as a means of attacking single leg pickups. It's unrealistic for opponents to always be bent over, so we need a different arm drag to accommodate this scenario. It just so happens that a Sasai arm drag, or an arm drag combined with a foot sweep, is useful for this situation. Upright stances can be difficult to arm drag without conferring body weight. As such, John recommends combining the drag with the tripping force of the Sasai. The arm drag isn't the only way to get to the back, and we have other options available to us depending on the opponent's reactions. These are variations of throw bys, slide bys, and duck unders. On his scrimmage wrestling instructional, John teaches over 10 variations of these moves, which can be a lot to remember in the heat of action. After taking some notes and watching some match footage, I've tried to systematise which variation we should use in a given situation. The throw by is best out of snap underhook scenarios. The slide by is the most versatile out of the 3 and can be used to counter an opponent's collar ties or if we're able to get a front-facing body lock. The duck under is the first of John's suggestions that involve a level change and offers good solutions to an opponent's tie-ups or if we want to mix up our attacking strategy. Out of all the options listed, they all have the unifying theme of that they are low risk. A high risk takedown strategy would be where it is possible for an opponent to sprawl on top of us and have us stuck carrying their weight. If we're going to employ a strategy of fatigue over time, we definitely want to avoid carrying our opponent's weight as much as we can. There is another method of getting to our opponent's back, and that's through a 2-on-1 grip, often referred to as the Russian tie. Whilst the 2-on-1 is very effective, it's not something we get the chance to see too often. It can often serve as an intermediary step between the free movement phase and getting to the back. Many of the new wave team probably simply elect to skip this step and jump straight to the rear body lock. Now that we've had a chance to explore how we're going to get to the rear body lock, it's time to learn what to do when we get there. Typically, whenever we see the rear body lock, it's often followed by Gordon Ryan sending his opponents to the moon via foot sweep. In fact, we see this foot sweep so often that we'd be forgiven for thinking that this is the priority attack from the rear body lock position. Tripping finishes, like the Dayashi Harai we see Gordon use, are often preferred to lifting finishes as a means of energy conservation. Over the course of a long match, multiple attempts to lift our opponent for a takedown can become very taxing. In a shorter match, lifting finishes can certainly have their place. The priority attack from the rear body lock is to simply place one of our knees in front of our opponent's knees and put their hands on the floor into the 4-point position. Once they are in the 4-point position, it's possible for us to start going into our scoring and back-taking sequences. Anyone with any sense isn't going to let us do this rather basic priority attack. They are going to try and block us from stepping around. Anyone who has seen Gary Tonin's funny walk whenever he gets rear body locked will note that he has his hands positioned this way to feel for the opponent trying to bring their legs around him before he attempts his escapes. The takedowns employed from the rear body lock are often reactions to the opponent having good defensive hand placement and trying to counter us correctly. The way that John's instructional DVDs are structured, it comes across that the reverse Kosoto Gake is the default takedown from the rear body lock position. Based on match observations, it's clear that Gordon favours walking variations of a Diashi Harai, often managing to sneak in 3 steps before sweeping the opponent's legs out from underneath them. In the rare event Gordon is unable to hit the foot sweep, we see him opting for variations of reverse Taiotoshi. We don't see him go for this too much in competition, but there's reasonable enough amounts of footage of him hitting variations of this in practice. Slightly more risk-taking members of the New Wave team will often ignore the takedown and sometimes jump straight onto the opponent's back in an attempt to secure hooks and points. More often than not, sweeps and takedowns will not be needed from the rear body lock, as opponents will not only recognise what a compromising position they are in, they will often make attempts to escape the position. In situations where opponents try to roll, we either need to be prepared to follow them via crab hooks, or stop the roll and begin entering our guard passing sequences. If the opponent tries to posture and fight the hands, then picking them up and slamming them with authority may be what's needed. In any instance, putting the opponent's hands on the floor or putting them down on one knee gives us a great opportunity to score our points. The rear body lock is only one of our preferred positions. The other is the short offense position, which we'll talk about next. Whilst the rear body lock is something we actively seek, short offense is a position we may end up in out of reactions to our opponent's takedown attempts. But what is short offense exactly? A term used in wrestling, short offense refers to scenarios where the top athlete has their chest on the bottom athlete's back. The top athlete is in front of the opponent's elbows, and one athlete has at least one knee on the floor. There are 3 main grips that we can utilise in the short offense position, each with their own advantages and disadvantages. These are the chest lock, front headlock, and double pits. The chest lock works best when the opponent is backing away from us, or we need to pull our opponent forwards into turtle. The weakness of the chest lock is that there is no submission threat to the opponent, so they are relatively free to attempt to move and defend. Whilst it's great for putting weight on our opponent, especially in the later stages of a match, we do become vulnerable to ducks and peek outs. The front headlock offers a great compromise between positional control and submission. If opponents don't respect the guillotine threat, then we can end the match with a quick submission. Even without a submission, the threat of a Darce and Anaconda entries will certainly make our opponent pause and slow down. The danger of the front headlock is that skilled opponents will have access to our elbow and can potentially enter into arm drag reversals. As a result of the potential shortcomings of the chest lock and front headlock, John expresses his preference for his athletes to work from double pits, as it hides our elbows from our opponent. We can't stay here forever, as this is still a reasonably dynamic position. However, the priority is to attack an arm drag go behind and end up behind our opponent, ready to attack one of our scoring positions. Should the opponent defend the arm drag go behind, their posture and stance are going to be incredibly compromised, making traditional double leg takedown attempts far easier. We don't typically see the New Wave squad members go for double legs from the standing position, instead wrestling up from positions like guard and short offense. In terms of getting into short offense, the team utilises 2 approaches: proactive methods and reactive methods. Proactive methods are born out of successful snapdowns to front headlock, or if we're able to get to a standing front headlock and circle our opponent to the floor. Our reactive methods are initiated from various layers of takedown defense. Our initial layer of takedown defense is our hands. If we're able to post on our opponent's shoulders, we can walk ourselves back and have our head replace our hands as the block on our opponent's shoulder, ending up in short offense. Our secondary layer is if the opponent beats our hands, or we're able to down block by meeting the opponent shoulder to shoulder. ending up in short offense. If the opponent beats the down block and our sprawl is not enough, we must actively walk back and get our knees on the floor. By blocking the opponent's knees to stop them from driving forward, we end up in, that's right, you guessed it, short offense. After utilising our rear body lock takedowns, or short offense go-behinds, we will typically end up in one of these three positions: the turtle, referee's position, or the 4-point position. Even without our rear body lock or short offense tactics, anyone looking to defend takedowns and avoid conceding points will be looking at using one or more of these positions to stand back up. It is John's contention that, should we take someone down, a good opponent will be able to get to the 4-point position at will. Taking an opponent down and scoring points is incredibly difficult. However, as the opponent seeks to prevent conceding takedown points, this presents us with an opportunity to take the back. If anyone has seen John's Enter the System back attacks, there is tremendous overlap here as the system and methodology remain constant. The breakdown of all the aforementioned positions will revolve around inserting our hooks and the power half Nelson. However, the application for each position will be slightly different. The main theme across all three is we want to cover our opponent's hips. The steps I've summarised as follows: insert the first hook, establish diagonal control, complete the breakdown, and establish the second hook to complete the scoring criteria. Let's start with the turtle position. There is a reasonable flowchart of what to do to break our opponent down from the turtle position depending on our opponent's reaction. Ideally, we want to drive our knee in between our opponent's tricep and quad while establishing a seatbelt grip. Using our second foot as a kusoto and stretching our opponent's leg, we can insert our first hook on the near side. Next, we have to establish diagonal control, which we can do via use of a crab hook and upgrading our seatbelt to a power half Nelson. With the power half Nelson established, it shouldn't be too difficult to pull our opponent into a crossbody ride, extend him, and throw in our second hook. If the opponent does a good job of defending the knee drive and denying the near side hook, our new target becomes the far side. By covering the far hip with our knee, it may be possible to contour our foot straight into a hook. From here we have the first hook, and we can repeat the previous sequence of crab hook and power half Nelson, albeit the diagonal control will now be on the opposite side. In the event that we can't get either hook in, it's usually a sign that the opponent has kept their body tight. This leaves them vulnerable to being pushed and off balanced in either direction. By employing a tight waist and pulling an opponent back towards us, we can provoke them to base out with their hand, giving us chance to insert a hook. For a masterclass in breaking down the turtle, one match I would encourage students to revisit over and over is Gordon Ryan's opening match of ADCC 2022 against Heike Jusela. Gordon swaps effortlessly between variations of the three approaches listed, with Sean Williams offering expert commentary. This style of turtle breakdown is not exclusive to the New Wave team. Nick Rodriguez was able to win the inaugural Craig Jones Invitational by utilising a strategy of turtle breakdowns before strangling his way to winning $1 million. Realising that the turtle position is not a great place to be, an opponent may elect to stand up. In order to do this, they must post their hands on the floor, putting themselves in the referee's position. The referee's position exposes an opponent's hips, arms, and neck to submission. However, we can't expect them to be here for long. As soon as we see the opponent's elbows come off the floor, we should be prepared to take a double underhook grip and put weight into our opponent's hands. From here, we're back on the standard operating procedure of inserting a hook to the far side, power half Nelson to establish diagonal control, and then completing the breakdown. Despite his fondness for the power half Nelson, even John recognises its limits. If we're able to get 2 hooks in, the power half will be less effective, as we no longer have diagonal control. In these circumstances, John recommends going in front of the shoulder and reinforcing the grip with an underclasp, and driving forwards to flatten our opponent to the mat. The 4-point position doesn't make much sense in a pure Jiu-Jitsu context. However, if the opponent is seeking to avoid takedowns and get back to the standing position, then this will be a common scenario we will find ourselves in. Dealing with the 4-point will fall under 2 types. One where we're already on the back of our opponents, and the other where we're yet to establish any form of meaningful control. Typically, under a points rule set, the new wave athletes opt for a score points first, then break the opponent down second approach. If we're already on the back of our opponent, we need to opt for asymmetrical hooks and double underhook grips to avoid sliding off our opponent's back. This is what John refers to as the long hook, short hook position. Our strategy for long hook, short hook once again revolves around the power half Nelson. If the opponent is able to strip off or step around our short hook, then we'll see the team utilise a high ball ride, locking ankles over the opponent's hip. Very often we'll see the new wave athletes jump on an opponent's back the moment the opponent is near a 4-point position. However, there may be some instances where we are unable to throw hooks in. In these situations, John will advocate for bringing an opponent down to one knee and then score from there. Despite teaching a variety of breakdowns in his series, John classifies the shoelace breakdown as one of his favourites. It's not hard to see why. The premise of the shoelace breakdown is pretty basic. Simply step on the opponent's shoelaces and drive weight into their hands. The shoelace breakdown can be performed on either the front leg or the back leg, and if we can't get either breakdown to work, we can simply elect to step over into the long short position. It's quite rare that we'll see other breakdowns from John's students, although honourable mentions include when Gary Tonin was successfully able to hit Wagner Hosha with the earth at ADCC 2017, and when George St. Pierre hit a gorgeous back cradle breakdown against Thiago Alves. Given the rule structure of Jiu-Jitsu, over 90% of points scored are going to come from mastery of attacking these positions. It only makes sense that we structure a large portion of our training around this one specific area. Whenever we see podcasts or discussions around the new wave session structure and training modalities, we always see that sparring rounds will typically start with 1 mount and 1 turtle round before moving on to other positions. This style of training must give the team a tremendous amount of confidence when heading into competition, knowing that they've probably spent way more hours than the opponents in these critical positions. If it works for them, maybe it can work for us too. It's very rare that we get to see an athlete at the top of a sport actively learning and implementing new skills against a variety of opponents. Gordon Ryan was always one of the top athletes in the world throughout his ADCC career. However, each competition cycle he competed in brought new skills and new styles. As students, this gives us a real-time look at what skills he was working on and what problems he encountered along the way. Despite being early in his career, the Gordon we saw at 2017 was one of my favourite athletes to study. He was still very rough around the edges in terms of skill. He was only 22 years old, so clearly had many more years ahead of him in the sport. With teammates Gary Tonin and Eddie Cummings struggling with a free-flowing submission style, Gordon resolved to commit to a pressure over time strategy. If the internet chatter and podcast stories are to be believed, Gordon also made a point around this time to deliberately prove that he was the best guard passer in the world. His approach in the standing position was highly varied. We saw flying armbar attempts against Dylan Dennis, canny Basami entries against Cyborg, and a beautiful sliding arm drag against Janji Ribeiro. Despite this, it was abundantly clear that his strategy for this tournament revolved around use of the single leg takedown, able to successfully land takedowns against Romulo Barral, Keenan Cornelius, and longtime rival Felipe Pena. 2017 saw a very dynamic Gordon. He moved around a lot, he was very active with his hand fighting and feints. He also made a point to frequently reset himself near the centre of the mats so opponents wouldn't have the opportunity to run out of bounds. By the time 2019 ADCC rolled around, Gordon had an extra 2 years to develop his standing game. Gone were the feints and active movement, instead opting for a slower, more methodical style of play. Instead of opting for single leg takedowns, where he would end up trying to pass an open guard, instead Gordon focused on knee picks that would end him up in half guard, or situations where he could remain standing and weigh heavy on an opponent's head. For ADCC 2022, we saw what can only be described as prime Gordon, happy to shift his strategy depending on what the opponent's game was or depending on his mood. Pulling guard against Heike, passing Victor Hugo at will, Ashi pulls against Roosevelt Souza, and being completely unafraid to give takedowns away to Nicky Rod and Andre Galvao. Gordon never lost his single leg takedown skills, as the rematch against Patrick Guido showcased. However, over the years he has demonstrated something wonderful for us. In each ADCC he has been operating under the same system, however applications and the depth of understanding of the system were different. The Danaher systems methodology in 2017 was more like a collection of islands, with independent back attack, leg lock and standing systems in place. Over the years, what we've seen is the islands remain, but the bridges and connections between those systems become just as important. We've had plenty of years with the Danaher systems on display. We've even had opportunities for athletes like Nicholas Meregali, with limited no-gi experience, to practice the systems, and through seeing his matches, we're able to watch his progression unfold before our eyes. Now that we've discussed our preferred standing strategy, what do we do if the opponent knows what we're trying to do? And worse, what if they try to use the system against us? We better have an answer. The first level of defence is knowledge. By knowing what the opponent is trying to do to us is often the first step. It's hard to defend attacks that we don't understand, and even worse, trying to defend a threat that was never real. John comments that positional defence when it comes to scrimmaging is a big weakness in Jiu-Jitsu. Just as his squad looked to expose a weakness in leg locks being undervalued, so too it seems that the New Wave team has their sights set on standing escapes. Jiu-Jitsu has phenomenal defense when on the ground. However, the main problem with Jiu-Jitsu escapes is that the majority of them lead back to guard position. As Jiu-Jitsu evolves, we need to emphasize escapes that lead back to the standing position. We must be able to stand up after takedowns and prevent opponents from scoring points. The goal of these escapes is to go from turtle position to standing position without conceding a score. Even if the opponent is successful in keeping their hands locked, it is still preferable to stand up and fight the hands on the feet. The general pattern in wrestling is for the head to rise first when standing, which can be a bit dicey for Jiu-Jitsu athletes. Instead, John's preferred method of stand-up revolves around usage of the 4-point position. The basic premise is from turtle position to post our hands on the floor at an angle. Instead of 4-pointing naively, we're going to actively circle our hips away from our opponent as we do this. Then we can bring our hands to our feet and stand up. As always, what we want to do and what we can do are often two very different things. A good opponent is going to try and prevent us from achieving the stand-up at various stages. Fortunately for us, we can initiate escapes from most of these stages with variations of the same move. The Granby roll. A popular high school wrestling reversal, the Granby is performed by the bottom athlete rising slightly and cross-stepping under their own body. The cross-step allows space for the athlete to perform a shoulder roll to the inside shoulder. This usually culminates in a successful escape, but sometimes can end with us back on top of our opponents. More often than not, if we're able to achieve the standing position, opponents are going to be wary of hanging onto the hips of someone who is skilled at rolling out. Gary Tonin stands out in this regard, as opponents are very quick to allow him to roll out of what would normally be considered a dominant rear body lock position. If the opponent decides to hang on to the hips, then they can come along for the ride, as was the case when Oliver Tarza took on Tommy Langlacker at Polaris 26. The Granby can be performed even if we're not all the way standing. Anyone who has seen Gordon Ryan Granby out of Turtle will know how effortless he can make it seem. Taking the Granby to its absolute extreme, we can even see a variation being used to escape body triangles and back hooks. Oliver Tarza has possibly one of the most unique escapes to the mount and back position in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The New Wave camp was already known for its non-traditional kipping mount escape, and Oliver has continued this innovation with what has been dubbed the rotational escape. The Granby, however, happens to be the more conservative of the New Wave escaping options. Whilst risk-averse athletes like Gordon will threaten the Granby and hand fight to defeat, the more risk-taking members of the team, like Gary and Oliver, will seek to enter victors' roles. Not content with simply escaping the position, the goal is to put the opponent in a direct knee bar submission danger. To disguise the threat of the rolling knee bar, they will often play between stepping their hips away for rolls and fishing their arms back for counter wrestles or leg entries off the switch. Knowing the two sides of the battle with regards to takedowns and positional dominance is where the real fun kicks in. We can see a perfect example of this in the final of the European ADCC trials from 2021 when Oliver Tarza faced Joseph Chen. Despite initial success on the feet from Tarza, Chen was able to stifle a loss of the New Wave game by employing strategies that deliberately prevented Tarza from getting to turtle position. Standing up and preventing scores is only one part of the New Wave defensive strategy. But what happens if the opponent doesn't want to play the New Wave game and instead opts for a more traditional game of underhooks and front-facing takedowns? The default reaction to an opponent getting an underhook on us is variations of Uchimata. Any opponent getting an underhook on us must be met by a strong overhook. Otherwise, there is no reason why they can't simply run to the back. Considering the team emphasises getting to a rear body lock as a priority above all other strategies, you can certainly bet that they are used to each other's back take attempts in the training room. In fact, Michael Pixley was able to take advantage of this tendency by baiting Nicholas Meregali into an underhook before countering him with his own Uchimata. The Uchimata is one of the 40 original throws of judo, and honestly, it just looks gorgeous when performed correctly. Despite being one of the most popular methods to score ippon in judo competition, in a sport of no-gi jiu-jitsu, the Uchimata is used less as of a throw and more of a tactical tool to cause reactions to our opponents. Because the opponent will have an underhook on us, any overhook we employ will already give us a strong upper body connection. We can use our overhook as both an upper body pushing and pulling force, giving good opportunities to off-balance our opponent in multiple directions. In the instance of Uchimata, we want our opponents to have their weight coming forwards. Typical Uchimata setups would involve some form of lapel and sleeve control, something we're not afforded to in no-gi jiu-jitsu. As a result, we may see a wide variety of grip configurations, ranging from mercy grips to just an overhook with one arm. A successful Uchimata will put us cleanly into side control. If we're looking at efficient counters, then surely going straight from a less than desirable standing position to top position ground without having tried to pass a strong guard can only be a good thing. A less than successful Uchi will still cause our opponent to react, either by causing them to shift their stance or to post on the floor. Should the opponent post on the floor, this creates an extended limb which presents submission opportunity. In order to avoid this, we'll see opponents scrambling to recover. The Uchi has the added benefit of being well disguised. Depending on the opponent's foot position, there are options for Uchimata, Tayotoshi, or if the opponent keeps their feet together, Haragoshi. An added bonus is that while the opponent is concerned about their own foot position, they are also vulnerable to Kani Basami, the scissor takedown. While the Danaher team doesn't employ Kani Basami in their own sparring sessions due to the associated high injury risk, it's something they're not afraid to use in competition, as it's one of the few takedowns that can lead directly into submission. John Danaher has often spoke about Vakani Basami as his preferred takedown against skilled wrestlers, so it should come as little surprise to see Gordon repeatedly using it to jump on Bo Nickal's knees. In fact, opponents are so cautious and overreacting to the threats of Uchimata or Kani Basami that they will leave enough space for us to utilise all of the standing Granby rolls we talked about earlier. The Underhook versus Overhook battle is something that we'll become familiar with in our Jiu-Jitsu journey. As Jiu-Jitsu athletes, we're probably already used to the battle in half guard, so it's only right that we get used to it on the feet. But what happens if the opponent doesn't underhook us? What if they're good at leg tackles and traditional takedowns? What then? When speaking of single leg and double leg takedowns, you may have heard this expression. Double leg takedowns are hard to get to, but easy to finish. Single leg takedowns are easy to get to, but hard to finish. In the case of the New Wave team, they certainly live up to the adage of making it difficult for an opponent to finish a single leg takedown. The team often uses the single leg as a means of tactical assessment. Offensively speaking, members of the team will pick up single legs on their opponent with no intention of finishing the takedown. The act of the opponent breaking the grips and recovering defensively plays into our strategy of making the opponent work harder than us. In fact, John recommends to his athletes to not hold on to single legs for too long, as this can be fatiguing. Knowing this truth, the team can also utilise the opponent trying to complete a single leg unsuccessfully as a measure of expending energy. Gordon Ryan was able to utilise this concept against Pedro Mourinho and later Patrick Guido. The limp leg is a high percentage defence for Jiu-Jitsu, as the athletes will compete without shoes, unlike in wrestling. Despite being a core of the team's takedown defence, this idea of stepping out and high stepping combines incredibly well with the team's approach to guard passing and exiting leg entanglements. Any move where we can have multiple applications of it means we can practice it more often and thus get better at it in a shorter amount of time. The limp leg functions as good early defense if the opponent grabs a leg. We touched on basic takedown defense ideas when discussing the concept of entries into short offense. However, in each of these examples, we were able to prevent an opponent from reaching our legs. The limp leg has a few variations that the New Wave members like to employ. The common theme across all of them is that we want to create distance between our opponent's head and our torso. Typically, we'll see the squad frame, turn away, bring their knee above the lock of the opponent's hands, and simply kick away. The trick is not to simply kick away and expose your back. Instead, by maintaining connection, we can go straight back into counter offense. While the limp leg functions best against the head inside single, it can also be used as a method to counter head outside single legs. Rather than try to push the opponent's head away, we can simply employ a chin strap and physically move the opponent's head to the inside. In absolute extreme examples where the opponent has lifted our leg above his hip and possibly even passed it over his centre line, John recommends turning everything down to the floor, as if we're entering the 4-point position. From here we can seek to Granby, or instead slide our leg away, completing the limp leg before circling back to face our opponent. While single leg defence is aided by the fact we can use our free leg to defend, in the case of defending double leg takedowns, this luxury has been taken away from us. In the words of John Danaher, defending a double leg takedown is one of the more difficult tasks in grappling. Our first responsibility will be to turn in and whizzer, with the priority being to prevent the opponent from connecting their hands. The squad has mixed approaches to dealing with double legs. However, the two counters they seem to favour are hip heists into sweeps and roll through counters in the event of late stage defence. In the event that the opponent is about to be successful with a double leg, the priority is to turtle and seek to build height. As we discussed at the beginning of the video, not only does the opponent need to take us down, but they need to keep us down for a period of time. With the team being renowned for variations of body lock passes, which are in essence a deep and successful double leg, in practice, defending late stage double legs should be something they are incredibly used to. But what if we don't want to just defend the takedown? What if we want to submit our opponents? Can we do this off takedown defense? Or do we need something else entirely? Across various mediums, We'll often see John refer to the role of standing positions as the joker in the pack. We don't need to be as skilled as a champion wrestler, we only need to be skilled enough to slow them down and make them work. By slowing the action down to a more manageable speed, this gives us opportunity to employ various submission attacks. Most of the submissions we can use start standing, however ultimately finish on the ground. As such, John encourages his athletes to adopt an approach of fight the takedown first and apply the submission second. Because the amount of effective standing positions is reasonably small, John recommends specialising in one neck, one arm and one leg attack. In terms of attacking the neck, the high-risk guillotine remains the king of standing submissions. The Danaher team is often teased about mimicking a large percentage of Marcelo Garcia's game, so it only makes sense that they would co-opt his patented Marcelo team. Throughout the course of this video, we've seen that the standing game is inextricably linked to the ground game. In the case of the squad's choice of arm and leg priorities, there is no exception. We don't see the team go for too many Kimuras as counters to takedowns, but often the threat of a Kimura is enough to make an opponent on edge. We saw Gordon attempt to use a Kimura grip on Hulk at ADCC 2019 to not only break a rear body lock, but to threaten Sumigashi throws. For leg attacks, we already touched on Carney Basami earlier. However, we would be remiss to not mention that it is the #1 counter to a single leg takedown. The early days of the squad specialised in elevating opponents into cross Ashigarami via use of a seated Carney Basami, so it only makes sense that they would employ these tactics on the feet. The team doesn't exclusively look for submissions as counter to takedowns. In fact, the team is reasonably conservative in defending takedowns and shifting opponents into short offense, rather than risk attacking a submission. Standing submissions usually come in all manner of forms, usually to keep an opponent guessing. When Gordon Ryan faced Dylan Dennis at ADCC, rather than simply elect a pull guard, he shot for a flying armbar instead. Gary Tonin loves a heist, so much so that he faked multiple attempts at standing up just to try and throw a flying triangle on Gilbert Burns. Not all submissions are of the flying variety. Rather than simply elect to sit to guard, the team will seek to push the pace and enter directly into Ashi pulls. In the instances where this is successful, an immediate submission will occur, as was the case when Gordon Ryan stood across from Roosevelt Souza before heel hooking him. In situations where the opponent is wise to the submission, as was the case with Josh Saunders, Gordon will often get the leg entanglement as a means to come up on top if he's unable to get the finish. We've now come to the end of this standing study. By exploring the themes and tendencies of the New Wave squad, it hopefully has put us in a more comfortable position when approaching our own standing tactics and strategies. We may not have immediately improved our skill set, but we should at least come away with an idea of what to do. Across John's teachings, he preaches various themes across the Standing to Ground series. The first theme is that positional hierarchy does indeed apply to the standing position. After initially reflecting on our win criteria and establishing our game plan, we explored this concept and saw how the team does indeed prioritise the rear body lock and short offense positions. The second theme is that reshots are easier than shots. Shooting on an opponent that has compromised stance is often easier than a cautious opponent in a strong stance. This idea is compounded by weighing heavy on the opponent's head and prioritising getting behind our opponent rather than shooting for his legs. In addition, should the opponent shoot on us, we're ready to counter-attack immediately into our preferred sequences. The third theme is that submissions are the joker in the pack. The standard rules of wrestling are thrown out the window when submissions are present. Stance and shot selection must adapt to deal with what could essentially be a match-winning scenario. We can also use the submission as a measure to prevent takedown scoring, as, depending on the rule set, an opponent cannot score if defending a submission. The fourth theme is that the scoring criteria in Jiu-Jitsu is far different than wrestling. We explored how variations of the power half Nelson can be used to break down numerous positions to return an opponent to our preferred scoring positions and attacking submissions. The fifth and final theme is that Jiu-Jitsu must see takedown defense as two distinct phases. Stopping a shot is one thing, preventing an opponent scoring is another. Despite being a video of considerable length, truth be told, this is only a small part of the standing position. Each area of this video will have its own deep dive and associated rabbit holes with it. If you take away anything from this video, it's this. Hustle until you score, and if all else fails, just pull guard. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing. To support the channel, please know that watching my videos is enough, but if you feel obligated to contribute, you can click the join button and become a member. If you don't want to join and just want to say hey, please check the links to my socials. If you want to get yourself a sweet discount on some Jiu-Jitsu gear, use the following code and use the link in the description below. Cheers.